welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and this is Brewing with Underwhelming Commanders, episode 17. And this was another really close one. So starting out at number 3 is Jaya Ballard Task Mage, and this is a really fun, interesting card. 1 red, human spell shaper 2/2, has 3 abilities. Pay a red and tap, discard a card, destroy target blue permanent. Pay 1 and a red and tap, discard a card, deals 3 damage to any target. A creature dealt damage this way can't be regenerated. And you can play 5 red and tap, discard a card. Jaya Ballard Task Mage deals 6 damage to each creature and each player. That's huge. So first of all, I'll get into the history of this card a little bit, just because it's such a unique and interesting, super flavorful card. Those 3 abilities on her are copying 3 existing cards, and they're copying cards for which she has had flavor text on, right? So for example, the first ability is mimicking a pyroblast, right? And the reason they did that is because she has flavor text on this card, just the thing for those pesky water mages. After that, her second ability is an incinerate, and again, that's because she has the flavor text on that card. Yes, I think toast is an appropriate description. And the last one is inferno. Some have said there is subtlety to destruction. You know what, they're dead. So that's her last ability, and basically that was the idea with this card when they made it, which is what makes it such a fun card. All 3 of those other cards were created long before she ever was. Those were cards that have been around in the game for a long time, and because she had flavor text on all those cards, when they finally made the actual card Jaya Ballard Task Mage, they put those 3 abilities on her. So just a fantastic flavorful card. But how are we going to build a deck with her is the most important part. And the first thing is, well, that first ability, destroy target blue permanent, is pretty fantastic. It would be even more fantastic if everything was blue. So I think you got to throw a Painter's Servant in this deck, right? Making everything blue can just make your commander so incredibly powerful. Just 1 red and tap and discard a card to destroy any permanent on the battlefield is going to be fantastic. We can also use Distorting Lens here, same thing. This is just a one-shot, but good enough because our commander's ability is a one-shot as well. We partner these 2 things together and we can just turn something blue and then follow up with our commander's ability and destroy it. Or destroy a couple of things if she's wearing an Illusionist Bracers or a Battle Mage's Bracers. Either of these are going to be fantastic on our commander because it will copy her ability. Battle Mage's Bracers actually gives her haste, which is even better because we can use that ability right away. And then whenever an ability of equipped creature is activated, if it is a mana ability, you may pay 1 if you do copy that ability. We're going to be throwing lots of damage around with our commander, so I think this is yet another deck where Chandra's Incinerator is pretty dang good. Even if we just shoot one of our opponents with that Incinerate ability, our Chandra's Incinerator is only going to cost 3 mana, and now we don't have to shoot our opponent's creatures with that Incinerate ability anymore. We can just shoot them, and then Chandra's Incinerator will shoot the creature for us. And then if we use that last ability, I mean, any creature that might survive that 6 damage certainly isn't going to now. Teralf, God of Fury, same thing. With that Incinerate ability, man, this guy gets out of hand. This could be even just a game ender. You got to be careful though with that Incinerate ability, right? It deals 6 damage to each creature and each player. So that's your creatures and you and also Jaya, right? She's killing herself. So maybe it's a good idea to throw a Darksteel Plate or something like that in this deck as well, so that you can stick it on her and keep reusing that ability without her killing herself. Also, of course, all the discarding we're doing, right? All 3 of those abilities are discard abilities, so we have to be building around that, absolutely. I would throw a bunch of Madness cards in here. Fiery Temper's great. Angie's Ravager is particularly good because when it attacks, you discard your hand, then draw 3 cards. So once our hand gets really low, now this just becomes draw 3 cards. But the more Madness cards you throw in here, the better, because, you know, that way we're not just dumping our whole hand all the time. Also, of course, we got to throw the go-to discard effects like Conspiracy Theorist and Surly Badgesaur. Going to be getting tons of value out of both of these. Conspiracy Theorist will just let us cast that card after we discard it, so that's great. And Surly Badgesaur will be giving us value out of the cards we are discarding. Browl and Skyshark Rider is going to get a +1/+1 counter and also deal damage to each of our opponents. And Squee Goblin Nabob is just an absolute must if you're in a discard theme in red, because at the beginning of your upkeep you may return Squee from your graveyard to your hand. So it's just a free card to discard every turn. You chuck it to one of Jaya Ballard's abilities, and then the next upkeep you get it back and you can do it again. I am not a huge fan of wheels overall. I talked about this in my cards that I never play. I actually have never put Wheel of Fortune or Magus of the Wheel in any of my decks or any wheel type effects. However, in this case, I think it works good because you are going to be emptying your hand a lot, and we need cards in our hand, right? This can't be like an impulse draw sort of situation. Red does that really well, but impulse draw, you can't discard it, right? It's in exile. You can only discard things from your hand, so we need to be refilling our hand so that we can discard stuff to use our commander's abilities. So this is a deck where I think definitely wheels is going to be useful. Also, Chiron Archive and Bomat Courier, these type of effects work here as well. Chiron Archive, at the beginning of our upkeep, we exile a top card of our library face down, and then we can pay 5 and discard our hand and put those exiled cards into our hand. So it's a way to refill our hand. Bomat Courier, same thing. Whenever it attacks, we exile the top card of our library, and then again we can discard our hand to refill it, essentially, right? Once we've discarded everything, that's when we use those effects. Also, wouldn't hurt to throw Basilisk Collar in this deck. I mean, you do have a commander that's dealing lots of damage, right? That second ability is Jaya Ballard, Task Mage, deals 3 damage, so that's her actually dealing the damage, and that last ability is her actually dealing the damage. So putting a Basilisk Collar on her looks pretty fantastic, especially with that last ability where you're going to be dealing 6 damage to each creature and player. I mean, first of all, every creature is going to die, even if its toughness is greater than 6, because of the death touch, and then you're going to gain an absolute ton of life from that as well. And you could also throw Repercussion in this deck. 1 red enchantment. Whenever a creature is dealt damage, Repercussion deals that much damage to that creature's controller. So this is sort of the reverse of Chandron's Incinerator. You know, this card works fantastically in a Firesong and Sunspeaker deck, obviously, because you gain the life. Here, we're not going to do that unless we have our Basilisk Collar, of course. But if you're going to do that, make sure you don't have a lot of creatures, right? You're already going to be dealing 6 damage to your own Jaya with that last ability. Any other creatures, you'll be taking that damage as well. So if you think about it, she deals 6 damage to each creature and each player. So even if you just have your Jaya in play, you're going to take 6 damage from that ability and then another 6 damage from the Repercussion when Jaya deals damage to herself. So you're going to be taking 12 damage minimum here. So if you have any more creatures, that's going to make things really dangerous for you. Your opponents, however, I mean, again, they're going to be taking the 6 damage themselves, and even if they only have 3 or 4 creatures out, that can be putting them pretty darn close to death. So Repercussion would be a great way to sort of close out the game. Other than Repercussion, I would say the win con for this deck is just, you know, my Surly Badgesaur gets really big, my Browlin gets big. You know, I'm going to be throwing a lot of damage around, so close out the game with my creatures. I think that's probably a good enough way to win with this deck. But moving on to our number 2 this week, even though they got the same amount of votes, like I said, it was a close one. Niambi, Esteemed Speaker, and Jaya Ballard both got the same amount of votes. White and a blue, Human Cleric 2/1 with Flash. When Niambi, Esteemed Speaker, enters the battlefield, you may return another target creature you control to owner's hand. If you do, you'll gain life equal to that creature's mana value. So this is one of those cards that I think people see and they just don't know what to do with. And I can understand why, because you have a creature with Flash, you're returning your own stuff to your hand, which sort of leans towards a blink strategy, I think, which white and blue does really, really well. Also, though, you have a life gain theme here a little bit. You're gaining life, which is kind of a weird tack on that they did there. And then on top of all that, the last ability, 1 blue and a white, and tap, discard a legendary card, draw 2 cards. And it's weird because all the other stuff has nothing to do with that last ability at all, I don't think. I mean, I suppose you could find some synergies there where you flash in your Niambi, pick up a legendary creature, and then discard that legendary creature to draw 2 cards. I mean, that's the only real synergy there, I think. I mean, if you look on EDH Rec, there is 216 decks on there currently. That's pretty decent for an underwhelming commander like this. And I think the reason why is because you can go a lot of different directions with it. For me, though, I think that last ability is really where it's at. Like, the first ability is sort of a one-time use thing, and picking up your own creatures all the time can be really tedious. There isn't a ton of advantage to doing that, although I have found a couple of ways, like Azorius Aether Mage and Stormfront Riders. Both of these cards want us to be picking up our own creatures, which is funny. Azorius Aether Mage, whenever a permanent is returned to your hand, you may pay 1 if you do draw cards. So when we do bounce that creature back to our hand, we can pay 1 and draw here. Stormfront Riders is a really interesting one. Of course, it's from Planar Chaos, so it's got to be interesting. 4 and a white human soldier, 4/3 with flying. When it enters the battlefield, return 2 creatures you control to owner's hand. So if you really leaned heavily into that return your own creatures theme, this guy works great. And whenever Stormfront Riders or another creature is returned to your hand from the battlefield, you create a 1/1 white soldier creature token. So that's interesting. So these are 2 cards that will benefit you from returning your own stuff to your hand. Baron Tolorian Archmage also works here. I would probably put this in the deck no matter which direction you go. When it enters the battlefield, return up to 1 target creature or planeswalker to owner's hand. And at the beginning of your end step, if a permanent was put into your hand from the battlefield this turn, draw a card. So this guy's a great inclusion in the deck because we can play him, turn something else to our hand. We get to draw a card at the end of turn. For me though, I think I'm mostly going to build around that last ability. Discard a legendary card, draw 2 cards. In which case, Baron also works there because he is legendary, right? So I think he's going in the deck no matter what. I also think Teferi's Ageless Insight is going in the deck no matter what, right? Again, a legendary card, so we can discard this to draw 2 cards, but we probably don't want to because every time we draw a card when this is in play, except for the first one we draw on each of our draw steps, we get to draw 2 cards instead. So now Niambi's ability becomes discard a legendary card, draw 4 cards. That's incredible, obviously. So for me, I'm building around that ability. And if you look at the flash, I know people get drawn in by that flash. To me, that flash is pseudo haste. We flash our commander in. It's always great to have flash with your commander. You flash it in, our commander no longer has summoning sickness, which means we can use that ability right away. To me, that's the only reason why it needs to have flash on it, is I get to use that discard ability immediately on my turn. So I'm just going to fill this deck with legendary permanents. You know, for me, this is mostly a legendary theme. And of course, I can chuck huge things in my graveyard like Avacyn and Nezahal. There's lots of giant busted legendary creatures out there that you can throw in this deck, discard, and resurrect them with something like a Miraculous Recovery, right? 4 and a white instant. Return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield and put a +1/+1 counter on it. Loyal Retainers is another really fantastic one in this deck. 2 and a white Human Advisor 1/1. Sacrifice Loyal Retainers. Return target legendary creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Activate only during your turn before attackers are declared. So that's the only thing we are going to be wanting return is legendary creatures. So that's a perfect fit in this deck. And let's not forget to throw lots of legendary lands in this deck as well. Gaia Reach Sanitarium, Core Haven, right? These are just great cards that you could put in the deck no matter what. I mean, Gaia Reach Sanitarium is doing the sort of discard and draw theme that we already are doing with our commander. But these cards are also legendary. So later in the game, when we don't really want lands, now we can chuck them and draw 2 more useful cards. God's Eye, Gate to the Reiki, Flagstones of Trocaire. There's 2 more legendary lands that have no downside at all other than the fact that they're legendary and non-basic. And if they happen to go to the graveyard, we get a bonus there as well. There's lots of legendary lands that we can be using in this deck that we can just replace our normal lands with. And then you can just throw some legendary tribal stuff in here like Day of Destiny and Heroes Podium. We're going to have lots of legendary creatures in this deck, obviously. You know, the way I close out this game, if I'm playing this deck, is I get my Nezahal or I get my Avacyn in play, and then I just go to town and start smashing my opponents. And Day of Destiny is going to give all of those legendary creatures +2/+2. And Heroes Podium, each legendary creature you control gets +1/+1 for each other legendary creature you control. So that's, again, going to give our legendary creatures a huge boost. And then we can pay X and tap. Look at the top X cards of your library. You may reveal a legendary creature card from among them, put it into your hand, and put the rest on the bottom of your library in random order. And in particular, you know, you think about our commander's ability, you know, we can use that whenever we want. We can do that at an end step. This ability we can also use at an end step. You know, our commander has flash, so I would probably engineer this deck in more of a control fashion where I'm sort of sitting back, waiting to see what my opponents are going to do. And then on the end step before my turn, then I use my Niambi, or then I use my Heroes Podium, or then I cast my Miraculous Recovery. A lot of the cards I mentioned you can use at instant speed so that you can be just holding back and playing more of a control game, which of course Azorius Colors does really, really well. But coming in at number 1 this week is Seizan, Perverter of Truth. And this is just such an interesting commander. 3 black, black, Demon Spirit, 6/5. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player loses 2 life and draws 2 cards. Such an interesting commander because it's sort of doing a bit of a hug theme, right? You're in mono black, doing sort of a hug thing, but really you're not because your opponents are losing life as well, right? This is another commander that for me, when I first started playing this format, a guy I played with regularly had a Seizan Perverter of Truth deck, and man, I just loved playing against it. It wasn't a hug deck. He was actually trying to kill us, and that's what I'm doing with this deck. This deck is out to win, no question about it, but you can't help getting around the helping your opponents draw theme, right? You have to embrace that. Your opponents are going to be drawing like crazy, and of course, because of that, they're going to sort of like you in a way, right? It's sort of, you sort of end up making friends because, oh, well, that guy's drawing me cards, so I'm going to leave him alone, right? It actually helps your deck out. It's an inadvertent strategy of what the deck is doing where I'm letting my opponents draw cards, so they're probably going to leave me alone, or they're probably not going to kill my commander because my commander's letting them draw 2 extra cards every turn, right? So it is an inadvertent advantage of what you want to be doing, even though you're going to be killing your opponents with this deck, though, but maybe in more of a sneaky way. The first thing we got to do, though, is throw some more hug type effects in here, like Howling Mine and Font of Mythos, right? Because we actually do want our opponents to be drawing lots of cards. We also want to be drawing cards too. Don't forget, we're getting all the advantages of this as well. These are symmetrical effects. Our commander and these artifacts are all symmetrical. However, we're going to be breaking symmetry with this deck as much as we can. I also got Master of the Feast in here and Coveted Jewel. Master of the Feast is going to let our opponents, just our opponents, draw an extra card at the beginning of our upkeep. We are going to be bringing our opponent's life to 0, right? The win con for this deck is that our opponent's life gets reduced to 0, so having a giant 5/5 flyer to swing in and do damage with is certainly going to help out. Also makes for a great blocker if we need that situation as well, and we will need that situation with Coveted Jewel in play, because when it enters the battlefield, we get to draw 3 cards. It also adds 3 mana of any one color, but whenever one or more creatures an opponent controls attack you and aren't blocked, that player draws 3 cards and gains control of Coveted Jewel and untaps it. I have this card in my Gerard deck because that has a sacrifice artifact theme, so if I play it and I get into a situation where opponents are going to attack and I can't block and they're about to gain control of my Coveted Jewel, I can just sacrifice it in response. In this deck, we're okay with it. You know, we want our opponents to draw cards, so we're going to get all the advantage out of this, and then if our opponents happen to gain control of it, that's okay. We want them to be drawing cards, so it works for us. Obviously, the first place you're going to go with this deck is Underworld Dreams and Fate Unraveler. These are just absolute musts in this deck. They really can go in any deck because every deck is going to want to be drawing lots of cards. Even if you're not playing this deck, people are going to have Rhystic Studies and Esper Sentinels and all these other cards that draw lots, and whenever they do, they're going to be taking a damage, right? These aren't symmetrical though. They're only hitting our opponents, and whenever they draw a card, they're going to take a damage. So with just our commander in play, at the beginning of an opponent's upkeep, they're going to lose 2 life and draw 2 cards, and then of course they're also going to draw the card at their draw step like they normally do. So now they're drawing 3 cards and they're taking 3 more damage from the 3 cards they've drawn if we have an Underworld Dreams in play. So they've now lost 5 total life just from our commander and Underworld Dreams being in play. 5 life a turn, that's kind of a lot. You know, people will be greedy. They'll love getting all the card draw. Yay, I get to draw these extra cards every turn. But they're going to notice pretty quick that it is really hurting them and they're going to want to do something about it. Speaking of greedy, I think Pain's Reward is just a fantastic, hilarious include in this deck. 2 and a black sorcery. Each player may bid life. You start the bidding with a bid of any number. In turn order, each player may top the high bid. The bidding ends when the high bid stands. The highest bidder loses that much life and draws 4 cards. So this card in this deck, I think is really funny, right? Because again, we want our opponents to draw cards. We bid as well. You know, if you want to draw some cards, you can bid here too. This is helping us in so many ways because it is decreasing our opponent's life total, which is how we're going to win the game, right? They're bidding an amount of life and they're drawing cards, which we also want. If someone ends up bidding 5 life for this and we have an Underworld Dreams in play, for example, they're now going to lose 5 life, then draw 4 cards and lose 4 more life. So they're going to lose 9 total life there. And you know what? If none of our opponents want to draw because they're already low on life, that's fine. We'll bid 1 life and we'll pay 3 and draw 4 cards. We're totally okay with that. Peer into the Abyss obviously is just going to be a win con in this deck, right? 4 black, black, black sorcery. Target player draws cards equal to half the number of cards in their library and loses half their life, round up each time. So this is just going to kill someone, right? If we have an Underworld Dreams in play, this is just kill target player. Price of Knowledge as well. This card was made for this deck. 6 and a black, so it's a 7 mana enchantment. That's a lot, but like I said, this is one of the cards we're going to use to close the game out. Players have no maximum hand size, so that's great for us because we're going to be drawing a ton of cards and we don't really want to discard them. We want to keep them in our hand. It's going to be good for our opponents too because we want them to have a big hand, because at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, Price of Knowledge deals damage to that player equal to the number of cards in that player's hand. Ouch. So if they have even just 7 cards in hand, they'll be taking 7 damage. If they have a bigger hand than that, which is entirely likely, they'll be taking a whole lot more damage. And Blood Chief Ascension, of course, a fantastic card in Commander in general, but particularly fantastic here because at the beginning of each end step, if an opponent lost 2 or more life this turn, you put a quest counter on it. And guess what? Our commander is making them lose 2 life. So we're guaranteed to get that trigger if we have our commander in play. And then, of course, if it has 3 or more quest counters on it, it just gets out of hand, right? Whenever any card is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, they lose 2 life and we gain 2 life. So again, we're in sort of that drain effect theme here, continuing to punish our opponents for their greediness. We got Black Vice in here. It was an infamous card back in the day because it's a 1 mana artifact that you could just play on turn 1, and when it enters the battlefield, you choose an opponent. At the beginning of the chosen player's upkeep, Black Vice deals X damage to that player, where X is the number of cards in their hand minus 4. So you could play this turn 1, and then right out of the gate, your opponent's going to take 3 damage on their upkeep before they've even had a chance to do anything, right? This card was even banned for a while in certain formats because of that. An Ebony Owl Netsuke at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep. If that player has 7 or more cards in hand, Ebony Owl Netsuke deals 4 damage to that player. So 4 damage every single time. Again, all of these things are really adding up. I think it is likely, given all the card drawing our opponents are going to be doing, they're going to have 7 or more cards at the beginning of their upkeep. And again, remember, this is only opponents, doesn't hurt us. Iron Maiden and Miser's Cage are going to be doing something similar. Both 3 mana artifacts. At the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, Iron Maiden deals X damage to that player, where X is the number of cards in their hand minus 4. So same thing as the Black Vice. And Miser's Cage at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep. If that player has 5 or more cards in hand, which is almost a guarantee, Miser's Cage deals 2 damage to that player. And don't forget, our commander's ability is an at the beginning of each player's upkeep. So these are triggers that are going to be happening at the same time. So we're going to have to make sure we stack them appropriately, right? We want all of our opponents drawing cards first. So we're going to put the Seizan trigger on the stack last so it resolves first. They're going to draw the cards, and then Miser's Cage or Iron Maiden or any of these other effects are going to check how many cards they have in their hand and do them that much damage. I also have Dream Devourer, which can foretell any cards in our hand. It can be great if our hand gets overfull and we don't want to discard stuff at the end of turn. I have no card draw in this deck other than the symmetrical card draw, right? I don't think there's any need for it. We only have the card draw that is going to be the symmetrical stuff. Our opponents are going to have all the card draw they would normally put in their deck. That's why I'm thinking that our opponents probably will have more cards in hand than we will. And also, don't forget, our commander is also losing us 2 life at the beginning of our upkeep too. So there is going to be some draining there. And obviously, this is another deck where I think eventually, once your opponent's life total gets pretty low, you're going to become a target. So gaining life is going to be important. Ivory Tower and Venser's Journal. Now we're taking advantage of the fact that maybe we have lots of cards in hand. Psychosis Crawler and Kaigamero First to Suffer are also going to be great. They're going to be fantastic blockers. I don't think we'll be attacking with them. We're more interested in their abilities, right? They do have power and toughness equal to the number of cards in our hand, so they'll be relatively large, but I think we'll probably save them as blockers. It depends on how everything's going, right? If our opponents don't have a lot of creatures, now we can swing with them. If they have a lot of creatures, we probably want to save them as blockers, or we might want to pay 1 black and sacrifice our Kaigamero, and all creatures will get minus X until end of turn, where X is the number of cards in our hand, so that'll be good there too. Couple other neat fits in this deck. Dark Deal, of course, is the black wheel, so each player discards all cards, then draws that many -1. This actually makes everyone's hand smaller, which is not necessarily what we want, but ultimately I don't think 1 card is going to make a big difference here. More importantly, this is our opponents have to wheel and then take all the damage from that Underworld Dreams or whatever the case may be. Head Games, this is a card I mentioned in one of my recent 10 cards videos. It is a huge advantage for our opponents to be drawing tons of cards, right? You're going to give them their win cons, you're going to give them answers to what we're doing doing. That's a tough part that you're going to have to try and deal with. And head games will allow us to give our opponent essentially a bad hand, right? Target opponent puts the cards from their hand on top of their library. You search that player's library for that many cards and give it to them, right? So basically we're going to take that giant handful of usable stuff. Say they got 8 cards in hand. We'll shuffle them all in and then we'll give them 8 basic lands. There, have fun with that, right? And while we're on the theme of punishing our opponents, Polluted Bonds and Nightshade Harvester, we're punishing our opponents for drawing cards, which every deck wants to do. Now we're going to punish our opponents for playing lands. Bloodseeker, every time a creature enters the battlefield under their control, they're going to lose a life there as well, right? We're really going to close the game out, I think, with these life drain effects, punishing our opponents for things they want to be doing. And of course, every deck also wants to be searching their library, so we got to put Opposition Agent and Obnixilis Unshackled in here. Again, allowing our opponents to draw lots of cards is going to allow them to play more lands, play more creatures, and do more stuff. So we have to slow them down a little. So these cards are necessary to slow them down and punish them for all of the stuff that they're going to be doing with all the cards we're letting them draw, right? But basically, that's the theme of the deck. This deck is taking advantage of the fact that we're letting our opponents draw, but we're also draining them 2 life. Don't forget about that, right? That adds up. And then you add up all these other life drain effects as well. And pretty quickly, your opponents are going to have to make a tough decision on whether or not they actually want to be drawing these cards, right? You're going to get to a point in the game where your opponents are going to be using their removal on your Font of Mythos, which is something people typically want to have in play. They're going to want to get it off the battlefield because it's killing them, right? Their hand is filling up with lands, but they can't play them because of the Polluted Bonds. They can't cast their ramp or tutors because of the Opposition Agent in play. So we're also sort of stopping them from the things their deck might normally be doing. I think it's a great strategy. I think this is a fantastic, interesting deck. Like I said, when your opponent sees the Seizan, they're going to be like, oh, sweet, I get to draw 2 cards every turn. And you're going to buy yourself a few turns, I think. Typically that happens when you play this deck. You're going to get 3 or 4 or maybe 5 turns of your opponents drawing free cards, and they're going to ignore you. And by then, you've already got your Underworld Dreams in play, you've already got your Price of Knowledge in play, and now it's a little too late for them to do anything about it, right? So I think this deck, fun and interesting, but also very, very viable for actually pulling out a win. So that is it for Seizan, Perverter of Truth. The deck list is in the description below. Feel free to give it a spin. Also in the description below is the poll for the next Underwhelming Commanders video. Go vote to see which commanders we're going to be doing in the next episode. But that is it for today, and thanks for tuning in.